The next morning, when the Otis family met at breakfast, they discussed the ghost at some length. The United States minister was naturally a little annoyed to find that his present had not been accepted. I have no wish, he said, to do the ghost any personal injury, and I must say that considering the length time he has been in the house, I don't think it is at all polite to throw pillows at him. A very just remark, at which I am sorry to say the twin burst into shout of laughter. Upon the other hand, he continued, if he really declines to use the rising sun lubricant, we shall have to take his chain from him. It would be quite impossible to sleep with such a noise going on outside the bedrooms. For the rest of the week, however, they were undisturbed. The only thing that excited any attention being the continual renewal of the bloodstain on the library floor. This certainly was very strange, as the door was always locked at night by Mr. Otis, and the windows kept closely barred. The chameleon-like color also of the stain excited a good deal of comment. Some mornings it was dull, almost Indian red, then it would be bright red color, then a rich purple. And once, when they came down for family prayers, according to the simple rites of the Free American Reforms Episcopalian Church, they found it a bright emerald green. These colorful changes naturally amused the party very much, and bets on the subject were freely made every evening. The only people who didn't enter into the joke was little Virginia, who, for some unexplained reasons, was actually a good deal distressed at the sight of the blood stain, and very nearly cried the morning it was emerald green. The second appearance of the ghost was on Sunday night. Shortly after they had gone to bed, they were suddenly alarmed by a fearful clash in the hall. Rushing downstairs, they found that a large suit of old armor had become detached from its stem and had fallen on the stone floor. While seated in a high backed chair was the Canterville ghost, rubbing his knees with an expression of acute, which means deep, agony, which means pain, on his face. The twins, having brought their pea shooters with them, at once discharged two pellets, which means small metal balls, on him, with that accuracy of aim which can only be attained by long and careful practice on a writing master. While the United States minister covered him with his revolver and called upon him, in accordance with California etiquette, which means polite manners, to hold up his hand. The ghost started up with a wild shriek, which means cry, of rage, which means anger, and sweat through them like a mist, which means pulling out Washington Otis candle as he passed. So leaving them all in total darkness, on reaching the top of the staircase, he recovered himself and determined to give his celebrate peal, which means loud, of demonic, which means life demon, laughter. This he had on no sorry This he had on more than one occasion found extremely useful. It was said to have turned Lord Wrecker wig grey in a single night, and had certainly made 3 of Lady Canterville. French governess gave warning before their month was up. He accordingly laughed his most horrible laugh till the whole volunteer, which means shape on an arc. Roof rang and rang again, but hardly had the fearful echo died away when a door opened and Mrs. Otis came out in a light blue dressing gown. "I'm afraid you are far from well," she said, "and have brought you a bottle of Dr. Dobell tincture, which means medicine. If it in indigestion, you will find it a most excellent remedy." The ghost glared, which means to look in an angry way at her fury, which means anger, and began at once to make preparation for turning himself into a large black dog, an accomplishment for which he was justly renowned, which means famous, and to which the family doctor always attributed, which means due to the permanent idiocy of Lord Canterville uncle, the horn. Thomas Horton. The sound of approaching footsteps, however, made him hesitate in his fell purpose, so he contented himself with becoming faintly, which means glowing, and vanished with a deep churchyard groan. Just as the twins had come up to him, on reaching his room, he entirely broke them and became a prey to the most violent aggression. The vulgarity means rudeness of the twins, and the gross, which means crude, materialism, which means worthlessness of Mrs. Otis, were naturally extremely annoying. But what really distressed him most was that he had been unable to wear the suit of May. He had hoped that even modern Americans would be thrilled by the sight of a spectre, which means ghost, in armor. If for no more sensible reason, at least out of respect for the natural poet Longfellow, over whose graceful and attractive poetry he himself had whiled away, which means spent many a weary heavy hours when the Cantervilles were up in town. Beside it was his own suit. He had worn it with great success at the Canterville tournament, and had been highly complimented on it by no less a person than the Virgin Queen herself. Yet, when he had put it on, he had been completely overpowered by the weight of the huge breastplate and steel casque, and had fallen heavily on the stone pavement, barking both his knees severely and bruising the knuckles of his right hand. For some days after this, he was extremely ill and hardly stirred, which means moved, out of his room at all, except to keep the bloodstain in proper repair. However, by taking great care of himself, he recovered and resolved to make a third attempt to frighten the United States Minister and his family. He selected Friday, August 17, for his appearance, and spent most of that day of a large slouch, which means bent forward, hat with a red feather, winding sheet frilled at the wrist and neck, and a rusty dagger, which means knife. Towards evening, a violent storm of rain came on, and the wind was so high that all the windows and doors in the old house shook and rattled. In fact, it was just such a weather as he loved. His plan of action was this. He was to make his way quietly to Washington Otis' room, gibber, which means chatter, at him from the foot of the bed, and stab himself 3 times in the throat to the sound of low music. He bore Washington a special grudge, which means feeling of anger, being quite aware that he was in the habit of removing the famous Canterville bloodstain by means of Pinkerton Paragon detergent. having reduced the reckless, which means careless, and foolish youth to condition of degrade terror. He was then to proceed to the room occupied by the United States Minister and his wife, and there to place a clammy, which means slippery, hands on Mrs. Otis' forehead, while he hissed into her troubling husband's ear the awful secret of the charnel house, which means a place where dead bodies are piled. With regret to little Virginia, he had not quite made up his mind. She had never insulted him in any way and was pretty and gentle. A few hollow groans from the wardrobe, he thought, would be more than sufficient, or if that failed to wake her, he might grapple at the counterpane, which means bedsheet, with palsy, which means diseased, and twitching, which means uncontrolled movement fingers. As for the twins, he was quite determined to teach them a lesson. The first thing to be done was, of course, to sit upon their chest so as to produce a stifling, which means unable to breathe, sensation of nightmare. Then, as their beds were quite close to each other, to stand between them in the form of a green, icy cold corpse means dead body, till they become paralyzed with fear, and finally to throw off the winding sheet and crawl round the room with white, bleached, which means pale, bones, and one rolling eyeball in the character of dumb Daniel or the suicide skeleton, a role in which he had on more than one occasion produced a great effect, and which he considered quite equal to his famous part of Martin the Maniac and the Masked Mystery. At 10:30, he heard the family going to bed. For some time he was disturbed by wild shriek of laughter from the twins, who with the light-haired gaiety, which means joy of schoolboys, were evidently amusing themselves before they retired to rest. But at 11:15 all was still, as midnight sounded, he sailed, which means moved suddenly forth. The owl beat against the window panel, the raven croaked from the old year tree, and the winds went a mourning, which means crying, round the house like a lost soul. But the Otis slipped unconscious of the doom, which means death or destruction. And high above the rain and storm, he could hear the steady storming of the minister for the United States. He stepped steadily out of the wainscoting with an evil smile on his cruel, wrinkled mouth, and the moon hid her face in a cloud as he stole past the great ornate window, where his own arms and those of his murdered wife were beyond, which means paint in blue and gold. On and on he gilded like an evil shadow. The very darkness seemed to loathe, which means hate, him as he passed. Once he thought that he heard something call and stopped, but it was only the baying of a dog from the red farm, and he went on muttering strange 16th century curses, and ever an annoying brandishing, which means waving the rusty dagger in the midnight air. Finally, he reached the corner of the passage that led to Ruckless' washing room. For a moment he paused, which means stopped. There, the wind blowing his long grey locks about his head and twisting into horrible and wonderful folds, the nameless horror of the dead man's cover for a dead body. Then the clock struck the quarter, and he felt that time had come. He laughed to himself and turned the corner, but no sooner had he done so than with a petulant loud of terror. He fell back and hid his pale face in his long, bony hands. Right in front of him was standing a horrible spectre, and motionless as a carven image, and motionless as a madman dream. Its head was veiled and shiny, its face round and fat and wide, and unpleasant laughter seemed to have twisted its feature into a continuous laughter. From the eyes streamed rays of red light. The mouth was a wild well of fire, and a ugly garment, like to his own, covered with its silent snow the very huge foam. On his breast was a placard with strange writing in very old characters, some scroll of shame, it seemed, some record of scenes, some awful calendar of crime, and with its right hand it bore a sword of gleaming steel. Never having seen a ghost before, he naturally was terribly frightened, and after a second quick look at the fearful ghost, he fled back to his room, and tripping up in his long winding sheet as he stepped down the corridor, and finally dropping the rusty dagger into the minister jack boots, where it was found in the morning by the butler. Once in the privacy of his own apartment, he flung himself down on a small pallet bed and hid his face under the clothes. After a time, however, the brave old Canterville spirit determinedly itself, and he determined to go and speak to the other ghost as soon as it was daylight. Accordingly, just as the morning was touching the hills with silver, he returned towards the spot where he had first laid eyes on the frightening phantom, feeling that after all two ghosts were better than one, and that by the aid of his new friend he might safely grapple with the twins. On reaching the spot, however, a terrible sight met his gaze. Something had evidently happened to the spectre, for the light had entirely faded from its hollow eyes. The gleaming falchion had fallen from its hand, and it was leaning up against the wall in a strained and uncomfortable attitude. He rushed forward and seized it in his arm, when, to his horror, the head slipped off and rolled on the floor. The body assumed a bent posture, and he found himself clasping a white dimity bed curtain with a sweepy brush, and a kitchen cleaver and a hollow turnip lying at his feet. Unable to understand this curious transformation, he clutched the placard with feverish haste, and there, in the grey morning light, he read these fearful words: "Ye otis ghosty, ye only true original spook, be aware of ye imitation, all others are copy." The whole thing flashed across him. He had been tricked, prevented from succeeding, and outsmarted. The old Canterville look came into his eyes. He ground his toothless gums together, and raising his old and weak hands high above his head, swore according to the picturesque phraseology of the antique school, that when cock had sounded twice, his merry horn and deeds of blood would be wrought, and a murder walk abroad with silent feet. Hardly had he finished the awful oath when, from the redile roof of a distant homestead, a cock crew. He laughed a long and low, bitter laugh, and waited. Hour after hour he waited, but the cock from some strange reason, didn't crow again. Finally, at 7:30, the arrival of the house made him give up his fearful awake, and he stalked back to his room, thinking of his vain oath and confused purpose. Then he consulted several books of ancient clevery, of which he was exceedingly fond, and found that on every occasion on which his oath has been used, Chanticleer had always crowned a second time. Internal death sighs the naughty fall, he muttered. I have seen the day when, with my shout spear, I would have run him through the gorge and made him crow for me and truth in that. He then retired to a comfortable lead coffin and stayed there till evening.